One last quick look at our power functions, and this is the effect of a negative x. So in our standard power function we have y equals 1 over x. What happens when we have y equals 1 over negative x? The same with our truncus 1 over x squared. What happens when we have 1 over negative x squared? And also our square root function y equals the square root of x. What happens when we have y equals the negative or square root of the negative x? Now, your first instinct here might be to say, well, we can't have this graph because we can't have the square root of a negative number. But in y equals x, obviously where it's implied that we have to have positive values of x. Here, y equals the square root of negative x, it's implied that we have to have negative values of x so that a negative times a negative gives us a positive, and we can therefore find the square root of that number. Looking at our graphs, here we have a hyperbola, standard hyperbola, y equals 1 over x. What happens when I have y equals 1 over negative x? There we see the effect with the values or the y values being flipped. It looks very much like y equals negative 1 over x, and in this case, in fact, it is exactly the same graph because this negative here on the bottom line could be on the top line as well. So we have the same graph. The negative x would be the same as if we had a negative value for a on the top line here or out the front. Here we have our truncus, y equals 1 on x squared. What happens if we have a negative x and we square it? If we think about this a little bit, a negative x squared is the same as a positive x squared. So perhaps, whereas we might have thought initially we're going to have an upside down truncus, as we do if we have a negative a, in fact, we have no change at all. Some might suggest that the x values, or this side here, is flipped over to this side of the graph, and the original values here are flipped over this side of the graph, but the shape of our graph doesn't change. The biggest change we'll see is in our square root function. Y equals the square root of x. Obviously, we're only allowed positive values of x. When we have y equals the negative square root of x, or sorry, we have y equals the square root of negative x, we're only going to be allowed negative values of x. And so now we have the situation where the graph is reflected across the y-axis, and the graph goes this way instead of to the right.